So indeed, it's a really nice introduction. This is the line of work that I have been doing, studying technology with using ethnographic methods. And I am very grateful for the opportunity to come and talk about it, because it pushed me also to sort of make an inventory of all the projects I have done, and going back to where I started. So I was actually trying to remember the year. It was in 2012 when I did personally my own ethnographic fieldwork, and I studied this thing that was extremely new and hyped and widely discussed at the time, and that is mobile devices, smartphones and iPods that were at the time very new. And I did an ethnography in a surgical setting as well, in one of the hospitals that eventually also became the site for my another project. And that also what drew me and sort of showed me the joys and adventures of doing ethnographic work. I continued in 2014, where I studied the technology that you may be more familiar with. This is the surgical robotics, and I published another paper on that. As you see also through this inventory, it took quite a while. So both papers took around 5 years from the start of doing the ethnographic work. So first day in the field, and eventually towards the publication. It didn't feel that long, by the way, if you ask me for my experience. So this was just my early day years, but what I actually will be talking about and drawing mostly on in the presentation today is more recent work that has been done by these very nice and fine and accomplished scholars, whose faces I decided need to be shown to the world and advertised and in all their beauty. Some of these people you may be familiar with, like Lauren and Elmira, already quite famous, I would say, but other people are still emerging, and you will hear about their work in the next years, I'm sure, like Tomislav and Melissa, who are doing their PhDs here at KIN. And also Daniel did his PhD in Sweden, but I also wrote and worked on his ethnographic data with him, trying to help him make sense of the data. So these are some of working with those people actually made me realize some of more of the patterns that happen across different research projects, and how to, to see how to summarize and talk about them. So the topic of ethnography is, of course, a topic that we could spend half a semester or the whole semester discussing, going back to the epistemological foundations and talking about what makes this method so distinct, or why it is so useful, why I think everyone should do ethnography if you want to study technology. But I needed to include only some brief pointers in the most basic definition, and something that most people are familiar with is that ethnography is famous, or it's the special feature of ethnography is that it studies things in their context. So it doesn't separate the context from what is happening, but it assumes that things do happen and emerge, and the meaning is made in the context, socially and culturally. So it doesn't make sense, for example, to talk about social cultural factors if you talk about ethnographic work, because context is the thing that you're studying. It is also famous for being close, or getting very close to where the action is. You need to be in the field, studying the groups and people as they go throughout their everyday lives. You need to understand how they make meaning. You need to sort of almost adopt their meaning system in order to be able to report back their meaning system. And it's also famous for this immersion quality and the thick description as the method of discovery. So by getting as close and immersing yourself fully in the life of participants, you claim to have understood the world, and therefore you can go back to your own world. For example, in the early days in cultural anthropology, you would go far away to exotic islands to study the culture that for Western people seems to be trivial or strange or somehow foreign. And then you go back and report about that culture by having lived with those people. So one of the things that of course is required there is that you can become native. You can live with those people being there, but you also are able to go back and being able to reflect and systematically report. So These are most very generic things. And I had this one question that somebody asked me, how to decide whether ethnography is a good choice. And I had to think about that question for some time because I was looking for, maybe there is a recipe of, with this technology, you can do ethnographic research, and with this one, you cannot. But then I eventually realized that it's more that most of the questions, at least the way if you formulate your question in an ethnographic way, most of the questions can be studied ethnographically. So to answer the question when something can be studied via ethnography, I think is a practical question. And there are certain circumstances under which you could decide not to, or you could decide to do it. And those practical conditions is whether you basically have the time and resources. Do you have a salary that is paid for you to do an ethnographic research? And if you do, and if there is time, and your institution really tells you, yes, this 1 year you should spend by going into the field, then definitely the answer is yes. But if your institution is saying, no, you need to do an experiment, and somehow you want to do an ethnography in your weekends, I don't think that's a very good idea to do so. It also requires access, and this is something I will be talking about a little bit more, is one of the themes that I wanted to cover, but also what I think is a good thing to think about, and that's maybe not even a given or an external condition that you might face, but we often feel like an ethnographic story is written by a lone hero that went to the exotic island and then just wrote everything on their own. While in practice, at least in the contemporary world, it's not true. It requires a whole community and requires a lot of support, especially if you're an early career researcher, if you're starting, if you're a PhD student. You need to think very well if you do have this kind of support in terms of supervisors, or at least colleagues or co-authors, mentors, or in community and workshops, where you can get the support that you need. It's very difficult to do alone and shouldn't be done alone. So if you do have that, or if you think you can get it, then maybe you can consider doing it. So in typical courses that are taught about ethnography or textbooks, these are the 4 things that are discussed. So I decided I will just borrow this structure. They talk about getting access to the field site, being in the field, and how to write the field notes, how to analyze ethnographic data, and how to write the paper eventually out of the data that you have collected. But I didn't want this to become a sort of a short crash course in 40 minutes covering the whole ethnography course. But I did want to think about what is so distinctive about the projects that I have done. And luckily, there was a very good question that I received in preparation for this workshop, where somebody said that ethnography is a study of people. So how can we study technology with this method, if that's really about the social system? And I thought that's exactly the thing that has been characteristic of my research. And the very short answer is that you can study technology or digital artifacts, like that question asked me, ethnographically, and not only you can, but you should. But there are things that are not very obvious when you really focus on technology that is being used at work. So I decided that all these 4 themes, with getting access, being in the field, analyzing data, and writing paper, I will talk about what is so special about technology there, and what we have found, or what we learned was very important. Because all the other things that are generic to ethnography, to any other kind of research interest or domain, you can find, and I'll provide more resources on that. So with the getting access, I didn't get any questions about how to get access, or what is a good field site, or what is a very good case. But I do very often have this informal talks with people at conferences, that somehow my cases, or the cases, or the field sites that Kin has, for example, we have AI or machine learning in sports, or we have this robotics, or we have AI in hiring, they all seem very cool. And it seems like we just sit here and everybody comes to us with access to very, very, very cool, interesting phenomena. While in fact, of course, that's not the case. And some of the sites indeed emerge through our network, but very often it takes a lot of work to find them, to understand what actually we want, and where to knock on doors. But what we learned over the years, that getting access to the field site is actually not the nuisance. It's not a practical issue or like a problem that you need to solve before starting your research. It's actually part of doing ethnography itself, because the time that you spend, which is very often very long time, until you figure out actually what are the organizations or what kind of technology you need to study, is the time where that you also spend on understanding technology in question. And I'll give you one example of such learning that we had in our case. And that is very important, because in doing ethnography of technology at work doesn't mean that you just, you have the technology that is somehow tangible and clearly identifiable, and then you come and look at the social dynamics around that artifact somehow. But it also requires you to understand what the technology is, what is the state of the art, what kinds of applications are there, what are the differences between them in this specific sector. But also, once you do that, and it takes time, and it's definitely not less than 6 months, over this period, you also learn to separate the hype from the real thing. So, for example, in the Elmira van den Broek case, where she studied AI in hiring, she was talking to, I think, 20 organizations who claimed that they used machine learning for recruiting people. And once you really enter in, you see that they are not even close to doing anything that is related to machine learning. But if you read the discourse in the media or the public statements of those organizations, it does seem they're doing such dangerous things and they're so unethical and biased. While in practice, once you really put your fingers into the real technology behind it, there is nothing, and there is very often what we call inflated expectations. And realizing this is also part of your ethnography. It's also part of understanding what will be the research question, or what will be the kind of the agenda or the aim of the research. And another, maybe it's practical thing, but I actually do think it's very crucial. There has to be a match between the personality of the field worker, who probably has their own interests, who has their own kind of temper and vibe and the passions and the way of acting, and the field side. So we pay very, very close attention to how these two will, provide any kind of chemistry or magic. And based on that, we also then guide the person in where they will be. So, for example, Lauren Vardenberg, who studied police officers and went on different emergency response missions with them, used to be a pilot before she started working in the PhD program. And once we learned that she was a pilot, we felt like, yeah, she needs to do the crisis setting. And extreme context is good for her because she's strong and she has this kind of energy. And it seems not very scientific, but it has worked very well for us. So we were even extra attentive to these kinds of issues. So Tomislav's case, who is studying now AI in biotech and has the coolest state-of-the-art machine learning application that he's studying for seed analysis in a breeding company, he spent 1.5 years trying to nail his access. While now it feels like we arrange it for him, and that's not true, because he worked extremely hard. And what he started with is that he did a whole blown literature review of biology work in the biological sciences. So he came in and said that he wanted to study a scientific setting. He wanted to understand how science is done, because he comes from philosophy and he had this very critical approach to science. And then we said, well, then look at the biotech. So he really understood this range of those applications and really went into very complicated things that half of which we understood, but he did, and he talked to biology scholars to learn from them, and he wrote that literature review. And that literature review really helped him in then approaching organizations, because he had the language and he spoke with them as an intelligent collaborator, as a person who understood what was being done. We sent proposals to 37 companies, and then we met with 18 of them, and then we met with them again. So we had more than 35 meetings with the different companies to talk about possible projects. We sent proposals in different formats. Some of them were scientific proposals, some of them were more business-like. And then we went to 4 companies, to the physical sites of them. And then eventually only one said yes, but it was the very, very, very cool company. So we were very happy, but that company also already once said no before, and then they had the leadership change, and then they finally said yes. But my story was that it's not a linear kind of luck situation. I think they said yes because he had the expertise to talk to them in a very meaningful way in those conversations. So we were able to get in. So getting access, so my sort of one point is that getting access is part of the ethnographic research, where you get insights and you learn the technology in question, which actually then brings you access eventually. So the next theme that is very often discussed is being in the field. And it's a very large theme. What typically is being discussed is how you manage that you immerse in the life of participants, but then you stay focused on observing. You are able to factually report on what's happening. You're able to separate the trivial things from the important things to report on, that you manage to cover different perspectives. You're able to participate, but not to intervene. There's a lot, very important advice on how to write the field notes. It's really a systematic craft, but actually it's a science. How do you really write a lot of details in your field notes? There is a book that I recommended in the readings that is very, very nicely illustrating different ways of writing the field notes. But specific to technology, the reality of being in the field is that it's extremely awkward. And it sounds, it's an, when you read a paper, that it's an adventure and you're so cool and with all these different communities and this data scientists, and it's, amazing life, and then you just report on it afterwards. In fact, it's hours and hours and hours of being very bored, extremely vulnerable, because it's very hard to explain who you are to the people without really sort of spoiling the purpose of your research. But it also hard emotionally, because researchers feel extremely insecure. So this vulnerability comes from the fact that you're there and you have your hours that go by or days that go by, and you are unsure whether there is a technology to study or whether that there is something that you can write later about. And it has to, especially now in the pressure of publication, it has to happen now. Like, I want to have already my next submission, and there has to be drama involved, right? And when you come into the field, there is very often, I think there's most of the time, 95% of the time, no drama. You're very lucky if there is drama, and then maybe that's not the drama you want to write about. So it's very difficult because you're very insecure, and also because the technology that you thought you would study seems either non-existent or too boring, very trivial, old-fashioned, and not corresponding to what Harvard Business Review has written about. So that's the biggest challenge, I think, that there's so much inflated kind of expectations around what this technology is or its state of the art, that you need to reconcile it with the reality of those workplaces. And you also need to convince or sort of start to believe in the fact that in most workplaces and in most organizations, probably that's very similar, or even less so, because otherwise you wouldn't have gone to this field site in the first place. So those technologies lack the shine and glamour that you think you would find, and you need to somehow use that as an opportunity for theorizing about the nature of technology at work, and also as a way to not discard your research question completely, but instead inform your question and be in the conversation with the literature by actually telling the world that the technologies are not glamorous and not shiny, and you need to demystify the way they work, and find where they are consequential nevertheless. And that's very difficult because you want the drama, but it's in some other kind of location this drama is happening. So one example comes from Lauren's project, and I don't know if you can see her face, beautiful face here, yes, who went into the field to study predictive policing, which of course was great. And of course, people thought about Minority Report when she started, and they thought there would be some kind of dashboard, which would somehow influence the work of police officers in the field, and that was her research question. So how is work of the police officers changing when the predictive algorithm is telling them where the crime will occur? And that question made sense. There was also a lot of questions about the bias and the discrimination, which people continue to ask her. But when she came into the setting, she saw this very boring desks here, and also saw that the algorithm and the output of the algorithm looked like this map, which very often didn't make sense and was very often sort of discarded and forgotten and put into some corner. And the police officers also didn't really care or didn't even know there was an algorithm or the predictive policing system. So that created for her a bit of an existential crisis, because then she felt like, okay, this question doesn't make sense, and this, I don't know what to do with that, and so on and so forth. But as she pushed through, and she was very insistent because she kept attending many different meetings and the briefings where this police officers before the beginning of the shift would meet and discussed, and then she talked to the managers, and then she talked to the data scientists who actually gave her access to the organization. And by talking to all of those people, she realized that the thing that she needed to study is people who worked with these maps, which was a group that was actually in the back office and not very prominent in the organization, but she did study them. And another problem that she saw was that this group really didn't understand the algorithm, and they tried everything to understand the algorithm, but they kept saying it doesn't work. And that could also have been a problem for her research. But then eventually we made sense of it as the problem of opacity of algorithmic technologies in different ways. And then we theorized the coping with opacity. So we just followed what they did, how they struggled. And then we went also to the data scientists to see whether we can dig deeper into the opacity of those algorithms and understand the sources of those. And by covering all those actions and all these different groups, eventually we came up with what appeared in the paper, which was the coping with the algorithmic capacity, but also hitting the insurmountable knowledge boundary that is triggered by the algorithmic technologies. So these are the people that she studied eventually, because she pushed for to sort of travel across the sites to see where algorithms appear on the work floor. And then eventually, I mean, she has other papers coming out of it that talk about where the consequences of these technologies appear on when people go to the street work. But that's a completely different story. So the next stage is the data analysis. And of course, the data analysis very often happens at the same time in iterations. It's not that you're just collecting data without thinking about it. By collecting and writing your field notes, you're already analyzing your data. But there is very often a formal stage where you're leaving the field and you have all your notes and all your interview transcripts and everything uploaded into your Atlas or NVivo or whatever program people use, and where you try to summarize and analyze the data. So regarding technology, what has been very helpful for us is to not lose sight, because there's so many things that possibly are interesting in the field, and also sometimes people, your informants will give you topics to study, and then they would say it's all a power conflict between these two departments. So what the challenge is that you don't forget that you're studying technology. And therefore, in your analytical efforts, it's very important that all the memos you're writing and the tables you're constructing, you're trying to get to the bottom of what technologically is happening here. And that can be different things. So depending on the research design, if you have data that, or if you have been in the field for a longer time, 2 or 3 years, you can develop a timeline of how things developed. So you can try to separate and write down all the events where, for example, certain design choices have been made, they have been discussed, people have debated, for example, the meaning or the purpose of the project itself. If there has been disagreements about what to do, what is there any compromise, for example, that has been a very important focus point for us with an MSQ paper. What also helps if you play with comparing different, by describing or finding dimensions in which the old way of working, for example, differs with the new way of working, and then trying to figure out how technology plays a role there. Here, the Miles and Huberman textbook is actually very helpful. It has a lot of chapters with different examples on how to do these tables. So for me, and that's actually the very consistent advice that I have heard, that systematic coding that goes line by line through, for example, your field notes or your interviews, at the first stage of your analysis is not the best strategy, because you can very often get lost in the detail without seeing the bigger picture. So coding is good if you can do it on the subset of your data. So if, for example, you have different groups. So I had, for example, nurses, surgeons, anesthesiologists. I had different sections of those. So I would say, well, this week I'm only analyzing nurses, and I'm spending 1 day on analyzing 3 nurses that talk about it. And then I read it without coding it, and I try to write a summary of this nurse, and then I compare it to another nurse. But I really zoom into one block of those, and then I said, okay, next week is the surgeons. And then I really live with the surgeons in this next week. So you need to make strategies for not getting lost in the amount of data, and I think this summaries are very helpful, and the tables. And it's also important to understand that many of those tables do not eventually make it into any papers. But if some of them are very helpful in the insight process, it's good. You may include them into the appendix, because they do show the rigor and also your journey and how you went from the beginning towards the final insight. So we constructed this timeline with Elmira, where we focused on all the moments that happened that were consequential, I think, from the developer side and the training of the algorithms. So that covered 4 years, because we had the data for 4 years. And then with Lauren, this paper didn't make it into the paper, and this table didn't make it to the paper. And with Lauren, we made the similar timeline where we focused on different events related to the predictive policing system, and what was consequential. Like they switched from neural network to logistic regression. Why did they do this? Because they didn't have enough money to pay for the server space. And this actually was also a very focused strategy of our analysis. We wanted to first write down every change and then pinpoint where some of those changes may not have been very consequential, but some of them were. And this table allows us to see the events, but also see how the technology is actually a product of many, many forces or many events. Like you have the patrol officers, police managers, intelligence officers, but also the wider system in the country that discusses and pushes for the system. I had also a question about how you show the rigor in your evidence, and I wanted to include this table. This is from the older paper of mine, and that's a diagram that shows what was the question we started with, what we analyzed for, and how much, and then how did we change our research questions. So if you go from from the up to bottom, you see the differences in the research question, which resulted from the rounds of coding and more systematic coding. And some of the people are using it in our methods classes because they say it shows how you change your research question, and you should change your research question as you go with the analysis. And that's actually, it's very strange if you don't, it means that you haven't analyzed it in depth enough. So finally, I had the very nice question that I received while preparing, which was how, when you write your paper, how do you deal with the page limit? And how do you decide which story to tell if you're so overwhelmed with your data? And I have the very generic and lame answer to that question, which is it's a conversation between your data and theory, which is true, but it's so generic that I don't think it's very helpful for people who do that. But I'll give you an example. So, and practically what it means. So practically you are trying out different narratives or different stories and compare them with existing ones that have been published in your field, in your domain. So we construct tables where we put, okay, here's the radiology case on machine learning by Sarah Lebovitz. This is what they found. This is this case, for example, in criminal justice. This is what they found. This is the case that in this particular domain. This is what we found. And here's our biotech. And then we compare, by which dimensions can we compare? What are the outcomes? Did they find how do they conceptualize their outcomes? And we construct those tables over and over again. And that's our conversation with existing data and theory. And in practice, we make a lot of versions. And these can be the full-blown written up versions, but it can also be just a presentation. We do PowerPoint presentations to each other. So we present them in our co-author meetings. We ask people for friendly reviews, and we just keep talking about stories in our data everywhere where we can. And basically deciding which paper to write or what kind of story to tell is an answer to this question, what it is a case of, that people keep asking this question over and over again, and you just try many versions of what it is a case of until you feel like that's the question where my data is strongest about. So it's the problem is that sometimes you may have a very nice question and some data on it, but then you feel there are gaps in your data, that you, for example, only have 2 interviews with data scientists, and so you cannot unpack the whole data scientist's reasoning and assumptions and the world, because you only have 2 of those in your data, but you have a lot of other stuff in your data. Therefore, you need to change your question because your data is stronger on something else. So as one example, so we studied this system, which was real-time brain imaging machine, MRI machine, that was introduced into the brain surgery, where surgeons could scan and see what is happening in the brain while they were operating. And that was extremely, extremely new for them. So it was called IMRI, but brain imaging during the procedure. And so Daniel has studied this case for several years, and he had a lot of data that he has collected. So he observed procedures, but he also looked at the training sessions. He talked to a lot of actors, including the physicians, the technicians, people who remodeled the hospital. And he was there from the beginning. They bought the machine, through how they remodeled the whole floor. It was like an extremely big enterprise to get this machine into the room, because it's so heavy. It has a lot of this architectural problems. And then he had the HR people, section managers, nurses, and there was stories everywhere. The nurses' work has been affected, and reconstructing this room was very important. And we had to figure out, do we tell a story about the physical space? Do we talk about nurses? Do we talk about something else? So there was many, many stories to consider. We wrote a lot of memos, trying out those different stories, comparing them to existing literature. Can we say something about the space? It was difficult because the space is sort of a thorny theoretical angle. We presented different versions to see what people ask about, how can we sense make the case? Can we answer all the questions? Does this work? Is it fun? And then eventually we focused on the expertise coordination as the story that we told, because we focused on the brain surgeons and the radiologists as two groups. And the story was that the radiologist, after this machine came in, what happened is that the surgeon said that the radiologists have to go back, come from the basement up to the surgical room and sit there with the surgeons while they were doing the procedure. And that was very new for both the surgeons and the radiologists, because radiologists didn't like to leave the basement. They didn't like to be in the surgery because they were forced to answer the surgical questions. But it was necessary for both, because this machine showed the brain to the surgeons in this new way. And the only way to deal with this ambiguity was to actually bring these two groups in one procedure, which changed a lot of their dynamic in between them. And it felt like that was the story to tell, because it is in that particular instance where both of the groups, the surgeons and the radiologists, felt the most drama. So we found the drama by keeping to read what they felt strongest about. And it also seemed the story to tell, because by really focusing on what this imaging technology did for these two groups and why they needed to adjust how they work together, we made the substantive contribution. We felt like we had something new to say about this imaging, the affordances of this imaging technology. So that was the writing the paper struggle and which story to tell, which is, by the way, there was a question also, what do reviewers mostly concerned about when you publish ethnography? And that's specifically the thing where the editors and the reviewers, they want to know, what is it the case of? What story are you telling? And is your data strongest on this particular story? Can we learn something new from your data about the question that we care about, but we don't know enough about? And by finding that fit between, the depth and the richness of your slice of data, that is the strongest, where you also feel like the people in the field feel strongest about this, what I'm writing. It's not like I'm writing something about something that they don't care about. I write about something that is also very important for them. And that's what the reviewers push for. But that's also very difficult, because it requires being very deep in your data, but also very knowledgeable about everything that has been published or not published yet, but still in the making. So I think it's extremely demanding, and the reviewers very often, well, actually, I need to say, now that I'm also an editor, I feel like if you have very strong research design and very good data and rich data, and you do the genuine attempt to sort of be honest, be structured, and then consistent, very often reviewers react and see the work that is being done, and they're willing to help in shaping the story. But there is also sometimes this kind of advice floating around that you should submit early to get the early feedback, and that's not what reviewers want. Reviewers want that you do this feedback in the friendly setting, in the workshopping, and in trying out this in other venues, and then submit the strongest paper you can possibly make out of it, and make this sort of something that everybody wants you to develop further. And that's about the publications. So that's actually what I'm trying to say here. A lot of versions, so you need to have 1,000 people reading your work before you submit it to the journals, friendly reading, presenting everywhere to your friends, and create groups, support groups for each other where you read your work. There are very good resources on ethnography where a lot of other people talk about their experiences. I include them here. And the books, they also list all the books that are very that have been very helpful for me. And if you're interested, and if you have experience, and if you're fascinated by these kinds of examples, we have positions open for postdocs, but also for PhDs. And I'm still looking for one on robotics. So I'm using the opportunity to advertise it here. So that's it. And I'm open for questions.